Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We will now begin with Story 1, The Monk and the Mason, Chartres Cathedral and the Hidden Triangle. You are standing in the cool shadow of Chartres Cathedral, a place built not only with stone but with symbols layered in tensions encoded in geometry. Its soaring vaults and stained glass are awe-inspiring, but deeper still lie lines and forms you were never meant to notice. Triangles, angles, points of light. This is a story not just of a cathedral, but of a monk and a mason, two men who never met but whose shared language was shape. In the mid-12th century, when the foundations of Chartres Cathedral were laid following a destructive fire in 1194, the world was quieter than we often imagine. A monk named Gerbert of St. Loup, keeper of relics and scholar of ancient texts, was obsessively transcribing lost geometrical works mostly of Boethius, who himself had translated from Plato. Gerbert was not an architect, but he understood the sacredness of the triangle. Meanwhile, down below, in the dust and din of construction, Étienne Letailleur, a master mason, was making decisions that would determine the spiritual topography of the cathedral for centuries. Étienne could neither read nor write Latin fluently, but his hands were practiced in measuring rope and wooden compasses. He too believed in the power of the triangle not just as structure, but as symbol. In medieval scholasticism, the triangle represented both the Holy Trinity and the pyramidal ascent of the soul toward the divine. The monks debated this in cloisters, the masons embedded it in stone. The convergence of these philosophies shaped not just Chartres, but Gothic architecture itself. Chartres was not the first to use geometry in its design, but it was perhaps the most intentional. The Latin cross layout was typical, but the proportional relationships between the nave, transept, and choir aligned according to precise mathematical ratios, often ones derived from Pythagorean triangles. These were not accidents. Gerbert in his quiet scriptorium copied a passage from Boethius. Number governs forms and the heavenly motions. It is the key to harmony and beauty. For him, the number 3 was not merely symbolic, it was divine. And so when he learned that the cathedral's facade was being redesigned, he sent a recommendation via another monk to the architect, suggesting the dimensions echo the 3, 4, 5 triangle, the simplest of all right-angled triangles. We don't know if Étienne received this message, but when the west facade rose, its 3 portals reflected triadic symmetry: Father, Son, Holy Spirit, earth, heaven, man, body, mind, spirit. Above each door was a tympanum filled with sculpture, shaped to fit a triangular frame. Coincidence or silent cooperation? The masons of the period used rope-knotted geometry, simple tools, and oral knowledge passed from master to apprentice. It is possible they were influenced by Arabic geometrical texts, brought into France by way of Moorish Spain. The knowledge of the golden triangle, a triangle in which the ratio between the long side and the base is phi, the golden ratio, existed, though whispered more than taught. Étienne would have understood it if not named it. As the cathedral grew, so too did its layers of symbolism. The floor labyrinth still present today was not simply a curiosity. Its shape mimics a flattened, spiraling pyramid, encouraging inward reflection and upward movement of the spirit. Pilgrims walked it, not to reach a destination, but to internalize geometry as ritual. The stained glass windows, especially the Blue Virgin, were placed not randomly, but in alignment with the sun's seasonal arc. On solstices and equinoxes, rays of light would strike key stones intersections of sacred angles. These phenomena suggested to the people that the building itself was alive, responsive to the divine clock. So what does this mean? Were the builders of Chartres creating a Christian echo of the Egyptian pyramid, a sacred space shaped to mirror the cosmos, to harmonize the earthly with the divine? Perhaps. Both civilizations placed immense value on geometry as a bridge between the human and the celestial. Yet while Egyptian pyramids pointed upward, blunt and eternal, the Gothic cathedrals reached through the triangle, through vertical ascent toward the heavens. In some surviving notes attributed to Gerbert, there is mention of the Scala Divina, the divine ladder formed not with rungs but with ratios. He mused whether the spiral within the labyrinth was part of a greater cosmological design, one that linked geometry with theology. Whether Etienne ever contemplated such thoughts is unknown, but the stones he placed suggest that he might have. By the end of the 13th century, Chartres had become not just a marvel of Gothic architecture, but a pilgrimage of ideas. Pilgrims didn't just come for the Sancta Camisia, the relic of the Virgin Mary's tunic, but for the experience of space of light through rose windows, of echoing steps in proportioned halls, of movement through nested triangles. Today, when you walk the nave of Chartres, you are following a mathematically determined path of light and form, shaped by minds both mystical and practical. You are inside a pyramid turned inside out, its sacred angles dissolved into arches, its symbolism echoed in spires. But who truly authored the triangle, the monk or the mason? And why did both believe so strongly that sacred geometry could bring man closer to God? You walk again, slowly now, through the nave of Chartres Cathedral. Morning light spills through the lancet windows, and somewhere above, stone ribs intersect in perfect arcs. You're surrounded by the quiet hum of geometry, the echo of invisible triangles in stone and light. But what compelled men to shape such a structure so precisely? What were they truly building? To answer this, we return to the monk, Gerbert of St. Loup. He spent years studying geometry not as a science alone, but as a reflection of divine order. His library was modest but rare, housing Latin commentaries on Pythagoras, Euclid, Boethius, and Isidore of Seville. To Gerbert, each theorem was a sacred insight, each angle a whisper from creation. In his mind, numbers had personalities, shapes had hierarchies, and at the peak of all symbolic forms was the triangle. Why the triangle? Because it was indivisible yet made of three, a perfect metaphor for the Trinity. Gerbert wasn't alone in this belief. Medieval theology often merged mathematical thought with religious metaphor. The circle was eternity, the square was earth, but the triangle, it was the connection, the spiritual bridge between human understanding and divine mystery. Meanwhile, Etienne Letailleur, the mason, directed his team to carve and raise the flying buttresses. These weren't merely engineering solutions, they were artistic expressions of uplift. Each buttress sprang from a base and soared upward, forming an inverted triangle that both supported and symbolized. Etienne had no formal education, but he'd traveled to other cathedral sites. He'd seen what happened when proportion was ignored. He'd also seen what sacred symmetry could accomplish. Etienne was likely part of a lodge, the loose guild system for stoneworkers that existed long before formal trade guilds were established. These lodges passed on practical knowledge how to quarry, shape, and align stone, but they also passed on ritualized geometry, traditions encoded in drawings, symbols, and signs. Some historians trace these early lodges as the ancestors of speculative Freemasonry, though the exact connections are murky. Still, Etienne would have known the importance of root ratios 1, square root 2, 1, square root 3, 1, phi, and how to use them in laying out chapels and arcades. And Gerbert, he would write to neighboring abbots about the sacred ratios. In one surviving letter fragment, he argues that the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Solomon was itself based on a 1:2 ratio, a rectangle folded diagonally into the simplest triangular form. He considered Chartres a new temple, and wanted its inner spaces to reflect divine measure. Perhaps the proportions of the Sancta Camisia reliquary chapel were influenced by his notes. What's remarkable is that this geometry wasn't hidden, it was simply unspoken. Builders didn't inscribe triangle here into the plans. They used ropes, stakes, compasses, and above all, repetition. For example, the rounded eastern end of the cathedral is not a random curve. It's built using a succession of overlapping equilateral triangles, forming a stepped progression toward the central altar. The eye may not see it, but the body feels it in motion. This subtlety continues in the rose windows, especially the north rose. From a distance, it's a burst of light and color. Up close, it's an exercise in fractal geometry. The outer ring contains 12 smaller circles symbolizing the apostles, but their placement is derived from a rotated triangle nested within a circle. Each petal aligns with celestial and liturgical directions. On certain feast days, the sun strikes the petals at precise moments. Geometry becomes time. Gerbert and Etienne, never meeting, both pursued alignment, one in manuscript, the other in limestone. And they weren't alone. Across medieval Europe, builders of the Gothic style were employing ratios not merely for beauty, but for meaning. The pointed arch, a hallmark of the Gothic, is derived from intersecting circles forming a triangle in negative space. These were not mere innovations, they were meditations in architecture. We must pause here to consider how knowledge flowed in medieval France. The assumption is often of isolation, that monks remained cloistered and peasants illiterate. But in reality, the Chartres school was one of the most vibrant intellectual centers of the 12th century. Philosophers like Bernard of Chartres and Thierry of Chartres argued that God was a geometer, a divine architect who created the cosmos with measure and proportion. These scholars, influenced by Platonic and Neoplatonic ideas, believed that studying geometry was a spiritual act. Thierry wrote that geometry teaches the soul to ascend. For him, the triangle was not a tool but a ladder. So imagine now, a mason shaping stone with a chisel, listening to a lecture delivered from the pulpit above about the music of the spheres. He might not grasp the Latin, but he understands the metaphor. He lays his next course of stone with more care, trusting that his angle has meaning beyond strength. Chartres became a convergence point. Pilgrims from across Christendom came not only to venerate the Virgin's relic, but to experience the cathedral. It was rumored that the angles of the building could heal the sick, that walking the labyrinth could purge sin. These beliefs were not magic, but mathematics clothed in faith. The pyramid as a symbol is rarely explicit in Gothic design, but it's present everywhere in implied ascent: the vertical thrust of the nave, the tiered spires, the narrowing vaults that pull your eyes upward. Each triangle points you toward heaven. Even the iconography of the Virgin Mary, to whom Chartres is dedicated, was frequently depicted in triangular forms. In paintings and sculpture, she is often placed within mandorlas, almond shapes made from intersecting circles, forming subtle triangles that suggest protection, symmetry, and hierarchy. And perhaps most curiously, the cathedral's foundation itself sits atop older religious sites. Archaeological evidence shows that a pre-Christian Druidic shrine may have existed here. Did the Masons know this? Did they build atop it to echo older geometries? One tradition claims that a dolmen, a megalithic structure, lies buried beneath the crypt. Whether true or not, the story suggests a continuity of sacred shapes. In the 13th century, when Chartres was essentially complete, the builders added the two towers, one Romanesque, squat and square, the other Gothic, tall and tapered. Look closely and the Gothic spire forms a perfect isosceles triangle, balanced, rising, transcendent. A pyramid not of stone piled solid, but of space sculpted to lift thought. Centuries later, when visitors stand at the back of the nave and gaze toward the altar, they may not see triangles, but they feel the weight of geometry. They sense that something ancient and silent moves through the proportions, that structure is not only physical, but spiritual. So we return again to Gerbert and Etienne, one with quill, the other with chisel. separated by discipline, united by vision. Together, unknowingly, they formed a sacred triangle of thought, craft, and stone. But how did these geometric ideals survive so long without being written down in architectural plans? And if the knowledge was oral, what did the next generation of masons carry forward? You step again into the light. This time the cathedral around you feels quieter not in sound but in message. You now know what you're looking for. Every pillar, every arch, every ribbed vault hums with quiet geometry, yet it is not immediately visible. The pyramid shapes, the sacred triangles, they are part of the skeleton, hidden beneath the ornamentation. But the silence of these forms is part of their purpose. What happened to the sacred geometry that Gerbert of Saint Loup and Etienne Latailleur expressed in their different ways? Did it vanish with their deaths, or did it persist passed hand to hand, line to line, chisel to chisel? By the early 14th century, the great Gothic wave had begun to ebb. Chartres Cathedral stood largely completed. Other cathedrals followed at Reims, Amiens, Beauvais, each taller, more ambitious, more fragile. But somewhere along the way, the sense of spiritual geometry began to change. The masons still used precise ratios, but the knowledge became more technical and less symbolic. The original masons of Chartres left behind no blueprints, no comprehensive design records. What remains are the stones themselves and a few rough tracing boards, smoothed pieces of plaster or stone where angles were drawn using compasses and chalk. These boards were ephemeral, washed clean at the end of the day. Their designs passed through memory and muscle rather than manuscript. The knowledge persisted as a kind of embodied mathematics. The master masons who directed the builds were respected not just for their craftsmanship, but for their philosophical depth. To lead a project like Chartres required understanding theology, astronomy, geometry, and site management. Their tools, the square, compass, level, and plumb bob, became symbols of not just their trade, but their worldview. By the 15th century, references to the art of geometry began to appear in secular texts. One such manuscript, the Regius Manuscript, c. 1390, an early Masonic text, spoke of geometry as the foundation of all knowledge and traced it directly to biblical and ancient sources. The triangle was praised as a symbol of order, justice, and harmony. These texts show that the sacred aspect of geometry was not entirely lost, it had shifted. What once belonged to monks and builders became absorbed into proto-Masonic and esoteric traditions. The triangle survived, not in cathedrals, but in ritual. Back in Chartres, centuries passed. The Enlightenment came, and with it the demystification of architecture. Later restorations in the 19th century, such as those led by Viollet-le-Duc, focused on Gothic structure, but often missed its symbolic heart. The triangle remained hidden, appreciated more by mathematicians and occultists than by architects. But not all was lost. In the 20th century, architectural historians began to revisit the geometric planning of Gothic cathedrals. One of the more important studies was by Robert Grosseteste, a 13th century philosopher whose writings on light and form anticipated modern optics. He argued that the universe was built on geometry and light, two pillars that define the Gothic ideal. His work inspired new research into whether Chartres and its contemporaries were built according to light geometry plans determined by astronomical positions and seasonal cycles. Further evidence arose from the discovery that the cathedral's layout aligns not just symbolically, but physically with key solar events. On the summer solstice, light from the south clerestory strikes the high altar directly at midday. This was not accidental. The builders were crafting a temporal pyramid, one that pointed not just upward but through time itself. Even today, some masons speak of Chartres with reverence. The Compagnons du Devoir, a French guild of traditional craftsmen, still train their stoneworkers using practices derived from medieval methods. Apprentices learn to draw sacred geometrical forms by hand, to understand the language of shapes before touching stone. In their training, the triangle remains a central figure respected not just as form, but as philosophy. Yet the deeper legacy of Chartres lies not in the preservation of techniques, but in the endurance of a worldview, a belief that space can embody spirit, that geometry can serve the sacred. This belief is often dismissed today as mystical or irrelevant, but for the builders of Chartres, it was the foundation of reality. Think of the labyrinth again. Unlike a maze, it has no dead ends. You enter, wind your way inward, and then retrace your steps out, mirroring a spiritual journey. Its path forms a flattened triangle when viewed from above, wide base at the entrance, narrowing point at the center. A quiet echo of the pyramid form, inverted and humbled, inviting meditation instead of monumentality. The triangle is also preserved in ritual gestures. The sign of the cross, a daily motion for medieval Christians, is made along vertical and horizontal axes, dividing the body into three parts. Priests formed triangles with their fingers during blessings. Triangular frames surrounded relics, windows, and arches, reinforcing hierarchy and form. This quiet repetition embedded geometry into muscle memory. The people who entered Chartres might not understand ratios or root rectangles, but they walked, prayed, and lived within their rhythm. So what is Chartres Cathedral truly? It is not merely a building. It is a philosophy in stone, a collaboration between minds that never met, the monk with his candle-lit scrolls and the mason with his calloused hands. One gave meaning, the other gave form. Together, they proved that sacred geometry was not just for the elite, it was a way of seeing the world, available to anyone who could feel balance, proportion, and light. Even now, as you rest your eyes on the distant spire or imagine it while lying in bed, you can trace the triangle that binds its base to the heavens. You can feel the incline of thought, the rise of spirit, the motion from body to breath to stillness. We might no longer build with such reverence for geometry, but the triangles remain silent, waiting, steady as ever beneath the stone. And so, centuries later, as we look upon this majestic cathedral, are we still capable of building with meaning, or have we forgotten how to see the angles beneath our own foundations? Story 2, A Stonecutter's Code, The Labyrinth of Amiens. You arrive late under a gray French sky and the cathedral looms. Amiens, a lesser-known name compared to Chartres or Notre Dame, but taller, broader, immense in both size and silence. Beneath your feet, barely visible in the worn stones of the nave, lies a pattern. A labyrinth, a perfect circle drawn in stone, walked in centuries past, mostly ignored now. But this shape once held deep purpose. To understand it, we must return to the age when it was carved, when geometry was not just design, but doctrine. It is the early 13th century. The year is 1220. The town of Amiens is small, muddy, and crowded. Fires have ravaged the Romanesque church that once stood on this site. In its place will rise a Gothic cathedral, the new style, ambitious and vertical, aimed at the heavens but anchored to earth by plans that follow precise geometrical logic. Among the builders is a man named Jehan de Luzarches, the master mason and first architect of Amiens. His job is monumental: create a cathedral for one of the most politically and spiritually important cities in northern France. He is answerable to bishops, kings, and the church, but in truth, his greatest authority is geometry. Every decision from buttress placement to window height is governed by ratios, chords, and curves. Jehan is not working alone. His team includes stonecutters, apprentices, and a small guild of tracers, men who create the initial floor designs directly onto massive tracing floors using chalk and iron compasses. Among them is an older cutter, quiet and observant, known in no surviving document by name. But his work endures beneath your feet: the labyrinth. This labyrinth was not unique to Amiens. Others existed in Chartres, Reims, and Bayeux. But the labyrinth at Amiens had a different emphasis. It was a circle filled with quartered paths, designed not for confusion but for contemplation. Pilgrims who could not afford the journey to Jerusalem were encouraged to walk its length slowly, prayerfully, as a symbolic pilgrimage. But the design itself, a perfect circle, segmented and spiraling, reveals something more. In medieval cosmology, the circle was the most perfect shape, infinite, boundaryless, representative of eternity and divine unity. The inclusion of a labyrinth in the very center of the cathedral's nave was not decorative, it was didactic. It taught through shape. When you walked the labyrinth, you enacted a geometric meditation. You entered at the base, moved toward the center, were led astray, redirected, folded back. From above, it resembled the cross-section of a pyramid, a wide base narrowing inward. Unlike the Egyptian pyramid, which rose in height, the Christian labyrinth descended inward, toward personal revelation. But how was this pattern conceived? That's where geometry returns. The labyrinth's dimensions were not improvised. Its diameter of nearly 12 meters echoed proportions used throughout the cathedral. The ratio of the width of the nave to the height of the vaults is approximately 1/2, a dynamic proportion often called the root of 2 rectangle. This ratio generates diagonal lines that form right-angled triangles, echoes of the pyramidal form. Jehin and his cutters would have laid the labyrinth pattern using rope geometry, a length of cord, knotted at intervals, used to draw precise arcs and intersections. A central stake, with a turning arm, could inscribe perfect circles. These techniques had been handed down for centuries, possibly originating in Egypt and Mesopotamia, passed westward through the Arab world into Europe via Spain and Sicily. The knowledge was simple but sacred. There was no need for written plans, the proportions lived in practice. And though most masons were illiterate, they were literate in geometry. They could read a building's meaning through its measurements. The labyrinth was also connected to music. Boethius, whose works were still read in cathedral schools, believed that musical harmony and geometrical harmony were one and the same. The labyrinth sections matched musical interval spaces of fourths, fifths, and octaves, all reducible to ratios involving 3, 4, 5, the same sacred triangle referenced in Chartres. At the very center of the Amiens labyrinth, legend claims, was once a brass medallion depicting Jehin de Luzarches himself. It was removed in the 19th century, but its memory endures. Why place an image of the architect at the labyrinth's heart? Because to medieval minds, the builder's soul was as much part of the cathedral as the stone. The labyrinth was not only a spiritual path but a builder's signature, encoded in form. Let us pause here to reflect. The labyrinth was not just a devotional path. It was a code, a geometric record of human effort, faith, and philosophical ambition. It symbolized the journey toward God, but it also represented the journey of the mind from confusion to clarity, from multiplicity to unity. It was the cathedral's most democratic feature, a path not limited to clergy but available to all. And yet it was walked less and less over time. By the 16th century, with the Reformation and Counter-Reformations reshaping liturgical focus, labyrinths were often removed or covered. At Amiens, it remained, though gradually worn down by feet and indifference. Today, few notice it. Tourists walk over it without knowing, barely looking down. But the pattern persists. The silent stone circle beneath your feet whispers still. And it asks you to imagine those who carved it not for fame or even for beauty, but to reflect the order they believed ruled the cosmos. In a world where chaos seemed constant, famine, war, plague, the labyrinth offered a geometry of hope. But did everyone understand it? Did the masons who carved its path grasp the full spiritual meaning? Or were they simply following instructions, tracing inherited shapes without knowing why? You enter the labyrinth, not with your feet but in your mind. Your eyes follow the pale stone outlines, faint from centuries of wear. The path curves and doubles back, folds in on itself. You realize there is no way to get lost. And yet, this is the point, to walk without seeking direction, to follow the turning until meaning reveals itself. In the early 13th century, the labyrinth of Amiens Cathedral was more than a devotional path, it was an encoded system of symbolic pilgrimage, inserted deliberately into the sacred architecture. For those unable to make the long and dangerous journey to Jerusalem, the labyrinth became a substitute, a Jerusalem in stone. The act of walking it, barefoot, sometimes on knees, often in silence, was both penance and prayer. Yet despite its surface simplicity, the labyrinth's design revealed deeper truths. One of its most curious properties is that it appears to progress toward the center, and yet leads the pilgrim away from it again and again, only to return. This movement mirrors the spiritual belief that the path to God is not linear. You don't simply progress toward truth. You must lose yourself, double back, be humbled before drawing near again. The masons who carved the labyrinth were likely aware of this symbolism. Among them, a tradition existed of the journeyer, a mythical figure used in training apprentices. This figure, a composite of every mason who had wandered from cathedral to cathedral, was said to carry a rope with 12 knots and no fixed home. His map was geometry. His goal, understanding through building. At Amiens, the masons were organized into a compagnonage, an early form of guild system, though more fraternal than formal. These were not just laborers. They were artisans with philosophical leanings, keepers of practical mysticism. They believed that geometry had moral value. Straight lines represented justice, circles, unity, triangles, divine wisdom. For the compagnons, the labyrinth was also a test. It taught patience, measurement, foresight. Young apprentices may have been assigned to trace its pattern in chalk during winter months, practicing balance and proportion by hand before touching actual stone. Walking the labyrinth could serve not just a spiritual role, but a pedagogical one, a quiet classroom on the floor of a cathedral. This view is supported by architectural historians who have studied the floor plans of Amiens. The labyrinth's design appears to mirror, in compressed form, the proportional layout of the cathedral itself. For instance, the central point of the labyrinth aligns precisely with the midpoint of the nave. Its circumference follows ratios related to the cathedral's base spacing. The walk becomes a miniature echo of the cathedral's form, a kind of recursive architecture. That's not all. There's compelling evidence to suggest that the labyrinth's design was informed by celestial movement. The path consists of 11 concentric circles, each representing not just spatial distance, but potentially planetary spheres, a medieval cosmological idea derived from Ptolemaic astronomy. The idea was that the soul ascended through the spheres of the planets on its way to God. Each turn of the labyrinth, then, may represent a step of spiritual ascent. And yet it descends inward. How do we reconcile this? The answer may lie in the Neoplatonic tradition, influential in cathedral schools of the 12th and 13th centuries. This philosophy taught that the soul's journey to God was a return and inward recollection of divine origin. So the labyrinth becomes a paradox. By going inward, you ascend. It is a pyramid reversed, not climbing up into heaven, but folding into the soul. Jehan de Luzarches, the master mason, likely knew of these teachings. He worked closely with bishops and scholars trained in such thought. One theory even suggests that the entire cathedral was designed around the labyrinth, that its placement determined other proportions. If true, this would mean the center of the path was not an ornament, but a foundational axis. Some have argued that the labyrinth was also a calendar. The number of steps, around 550, though debated due to erosion, may represent the days of a pilgrimage cycle or relate to the liturgical calendar. Certain feast days may have aligned with specific points along the labyrinth, allowing pilgrims to time their prayers. In this view, the labyrinth becomes not a path to walk, but a clock to feel. Despite all this meaning, the labyrinth was eventually forgotten. By the 17th century, clerics considered it a distraction. Baroque aesthetics favored grandeur and narrative over subtlety and shape. Some labyrinths were physically removed or covered. Amiens was luckier. Though worn, its stone lines survived. Modern pilgrims now return. Some walk the path barefoot, some quietly photograph it. Most don't know its layered history. Yet, in tracing its spiral, they participate, however unknowingly, in a tradition of geometric contemplation. But what of the masons who carved it? Did they see their work as eternal? In some sense, yes. Cathedral building was not just labor, it was legacy. A stonecutter could spend a lifetime working on a single vault, never seeing the completed result. But the labyrinth was different. It was accessible. It was touchable. A master mason might have walked it at night, alone, lit by candlelight, considering the shape he had left behind. And what shape is that? If you flatten the labyrinth and draw lines across its segments, a series of isosceles and equilateral triangles emerge. The center becomes a point of convergence not just for the path, but for the cathedral's meaning. Everything leads inward, upward together. A triangle drawn in stone, visible only to those who stop and look. And that raises the question, why was this geometry so important? Because geometry was order in an unordered world. The 13th century was full of instability, wars, famines, superstitions. But geometry offered predictability, elegance, and hope. To walk the labyrinth was to enter a space untouched by chaos. Every turn had purpose. Every proportion reflected a hidden harmony. It was not escape, it was return. And so the path of the labyrinth continues across centuries and footsteps. It whispers to those who notice. There is a pattern even when life feels unpatterned. There is form even in your doubt. Walk and it will find you. But who walks the labyrinth now? Is it still a place of pilgrimage, or merely a historical curiosity? The cathedral is empty now. The tourists have left, the candles have flickered out. Only the faint ticking of an old clock and the quiet draft of evening air remain. You stand once again at the edge of the labyrinth, its worn outlines etched faintly into the cathedral floor like memory itself, fading but present. You feel its pull, not physically but through time, through intention. The labyrinth, this circle of silence and turning, was once a centerpiece of devotion. Now it's overlooked, often literally. Walked on, swept over, repaired with stone, forgotten. But forgetting does not erase meaning. In the long arc of history, the most persistent messages are those not shouted, but carved quietly in code. We don't know who first imagined the labyrinth at Amiens, but we know it was built, likely between 1288 and 1311. This places its construction just after the initial structure of the cathedral was completed. By this time, Jehan de Luzarches was long gone, his work continued by successors, Thomas de Cormont and later his son, Renaud. Each master builder took the previous plans and modified them, adding layers of complexity and beauty. Yet through all transitions, the symbolic geometry endured. The labyrinth was placed at a precise location within the nave, centered between the fourth and fifth bays, close enough to the main entrance for visibility, yet far enough that one must enter the sacred space fully to begin its journey. It was the threshold to meditation. Not quite in the world, not yet in the sanctuary. The pilgrims who walked it did so in a variety of ways, some barefoot, others on knees, some during Lent, others before long voyages. There were few fixed rules. The path itself was the teacher. Unlike mazes, labyrinths offer no choices. They are about acceptance, not decision. They force you to follow, to obey the turning, to trust that it leads somewhere. And always it did. But by the late 17th century, church authorities across Europe began viewing these floor labyrinths with suspicion. Some clergy considered them relics of superstition, no longer relevant to the liturgical focus of the time. Others saw them as distractions, their symbolism lost on common parishioners. The labyrinth at Chartres was covered with chairs. At Sens, it was removed entirely. At Amiens, it survived, but the brass plaque at its center, likely a depiction of Jehan or the Virgin, was taken up in 1825. Why the plaque was removed is unclear. Officially, it obstructed church cleaning or posed a tripping hazard. Unofficially, perhaps, it had simply become invisible, an object with no remaining story. And yet, even stripped of its centerpiece, the labyrinth remained. It could not be lifted like a statue or burned like a book. It was geometry embedded in stone, and thus, It endured not by attention but by inertia. It was only in the 20th century that scholars began to look again. In 1901, the architect Eugene Viollet-le-Duc, though known more for his restorative ambitions than his historical precision, noted the labyrinth's presence in Amiens and considered its proportional logic. Later studies revealed that the cathedral's design as a whole was governed by a geometric plan built around root rectangles, golden triangles, and sacred numbers ratios like 3, 4, 5, 8, and square root 2. What began as curiosity became revelation. Historians and architects re-examined Gothic cathedrals not just as aesthetic masterpieces, but as mathematical diagrams meant to reflect heavenly order in earthly form. The labyrinth was no longer decorative, it was instructional, a compressed mandala for pilgrims, peasants, and stonecutters alike. In the 21st century, the labyrinth at Amiens has experienced a quiet revival. It is now protected, even studied. Researchers from the CNRS, France's National Center for Scientific Research, have scanned it using laser and photogrammetry tools, confirming its symmetry, its alignment with the nave, and its survival despite floor repairs and erosion. But what about the human story? The mason who laid the first curved stones, the apprentice who double-checked the spacing, sweat dripping in the summer heat, the bishop who approved the plans without fully understanding the purpose. They are gone, but they left their message in stone. Perhaps the most powerful truth about the labyrinth is that it is an act of trust. Trust that the person who walks it will seek meaning. Trust that the proportions will outlast fashion. Trust that geometry, even if misunderstood, still holds its shape. It is this trust that the stonecutter left behind. Imagine him, old now, long after the scaffolds were taken down. His hands shake slightly from years of lifting. He walks the labyrinth he helped build not to seek answers, but to remember. Each turn is familiar. He knows the pauses, the false closeness to the center, the long arc away again. He does not question the design. He follows it. And when he reaches the center, he does not cry or pray aloud. He simply kneels and places his hand on the warm stone. A journey finished, a path confirmed. In modern Amiens, the labyrinth is walked differently, sometimes by schoolchildren on field trips, giggling as they spiral inward, sometimes by tourists who don't realize they're retracing a medieval map of the soul, occasionally by scholars with notebooks and measuring tape, and sometimes rarely by a quiet visitor who walks slowly, barefoot, alone. They perhaps understand. They feel the stones respond. They know that geometry does not fade, it only hides. And so, the labyrinth at Amiens continues its turning, long after its makers have turned to dust. It remains a message written not in ink or speech, but in curves and silence. The triangle is still there, folded within the circle. The pyramid is inverted, spiraling inward instead of up. It points not to heaven, but to the heart. And that leads us to one final question. In a world that has forgotten how to read geometry, who will still walk the ancient paths and why? Story 3. Gothic Spires and the Echo of Egypt. The Cistercians' Silent Geometry. It begins in the forest, not in a city or a palace or under a spire, but in the deep green stillness of rural Burgundy. The year is 1115 and a group of monks are clearing trees in silence. They speak only when necessary. Their robes are coarse. Their lives are hard. They are Cistercians, followers of a new, austere interpretation of the Benedictine rule. They are here to build something, not just a monastery, but a philosophy, and geometry will be its invisible skeleton. The Cistercians were not architects by trade. They were monks, but their order became responsible for some of the purest expressions of sacred geometry in the medieval world. Their abbeys Fontenay, Le Thorinet, Saint-Inc are not grand like Chartres or Amiens. They do not reach toward heaven with flamboyant sculpture or radiant glass. They are quiet, stone, bare. Yet within that austerity lies something more, a geometry so disciplined, so precise, that it still draws the eyes of architects today. The founder of the order, Bernard of Clairvaux, was suspicious of ornament. He feared it distracted from contemplation. In his famous Apologia, Bernard criticized the Cluniac style of heavy embellishment, gold leaf, carved capitals, painted ceilings. For the Cistercians, the path to God was not through decoration but through proportion, light, and silence. And so, when the first abbeys were built, their layouts followed strict rules. The church faced east. The cloister was square. The refectory, dining hall, and dormitory followed the cardinal directions. More importantly, the buildings followed modular ratios, often derived from simple geometric progressions. The plan of a typical Cistercian monastery was based on nested rectangles and root ratios 1 square, 1 square root 2 dynamic rectangle, 2 3 harmonic, and 1 phi golden. These were not just pleasing to the eye, they reflected a spiritual cosmology, a belief that to build in proper proportion was to imitate the divine mind. This connection between sacred proportion and spiritual purity may have had even older roots. Though the Cistercians rarely referenced ancient Egypt directly, such things were considered too pagan. Some scholars believe that their emphasis on austere, monumental geometry echoes Egyptian architectural principles, particularly those seen in pyramids and temple alignments. The resemblance is philosophical, not stylistic. Like the ancient Egyptians, the Cistercians believed that to shape space in alignment with higher laws was to bring the soul closer to truth. One striking example of this is La Thorinet Abbey, built in Provence in the late 12th century. This abbey, carved from golden limestone, follows such precise acoustic and spatial proportions that it functions almost as an instrument. The ratio between the nave's width and height allows Gregorian chants to echo in perfect thirds and fifths, intervals considered sacred by medieval theorists. And the triangle. It is everywhere, though not in obvious form. The roofs pitch steeply, forming equilateral and isosceles angles. The chapter house where monks gathered to confess and deliberate is structured as a series of intersecting triangular vaults, each rib reinforcing the whole. Even the cloister arches are drawn from pointed arcs that rely on compass-set geometry, rooted in the triangle. One stonecutter's manual, dated later, but possibly influenced by Cistercian methods, describes a technique called the method of triangles, using overlapping equilateral triangles to lay out floor plans, door heights, and vault springs. This may have been passed orally through the monastic builders, many of whom were lay brothers, not ordained clergy, but skilled craftsmen living under monastic vows. Despite their simplicity, these abbeys were not rudimentary. They required extensive planning, engineering, and material expertise. And unlike cathedrals in urban centers, Cistercian abbeys were built in remote places, forests, valleys, marshes, often requiring full self-sufficiency. The monks quarried their own stone, forged their own tools, and sometimes even designed their own water systems. At Fontenay Abbey, for example, a complex system of water channels powered ironworks, grain mills, and gardens. The layout of these systems obeyed practical geometry, yes, but also the symbolic idea that order was a form of worship. Cistercian architecture became known for its lack of figural sculpture, no saints gazing down from portals, no fantastical creatures crouched on cornices, but geometry was there to fill the silence, and in its very quiet it spoke more deeply. Even the light was geometric. In many Cistercian churches, the only illumination comes from small, high windows set in rhythmic patterns. The resulting shafts of light fall across walls and floors in angled planes, changing with the time of day. These were not accidents. The position of windows was calculated according to solar progression, another quiet nod to the relationship between celestial order and earthly space. Yet perhaps the most powerful example of geometry in Cistercian design is the use of ratios between the human body and architectural form. The monks believed that the body was the microcosm of divine, or a temple made flesh. To build spaces that echoed the body's proportions was to build a place in which the soul could recognize itself. This idea, known later through Vitruvian theory, may have existed quietly in Cistercian practice. The dimensions of the nave in La Thoronet, for example, mirror a vertical 3:1 ratio height to width to length closely resembling the proportions of a standing human body. To walk through such a space was to walk within order, to move through a symbolic body, to pray within a geometry that reflected one's own. And while the Cistercians would have rejected anything overtly Egyptian or pagan, the similarities remain uncanny. Like the builders of pyramids, they sought permanence through proportion. Like the designers of ancient temples, they believed in sacred orientation, ritual alignment, and the moral authority of form. But as centuries passed, even the Cistercians could not hold back change. By the 14th century, Gothic ornament began to seep into some Cistercian abbeys. Decorative bosses, more elaborate tracery, and eventually even painted altars found their way in. The rule of silence softened. The simplicity of geometry, though never disavowed, became less central. Today, many of the original abbeys lie in ruin, yet their geometry remains etched in stone, revealed in shadow, waiting in ratios. Architects and historians visit them not for grandeur, but for clarity. There is something about the Cistercian ideal that continues to resonate, that a life and a building need not be allowed to be full of meaning. In these walls no saints look down, no angels trumpet, no gargoyles leer, but in the turning of the vaults, the span of the cloister, and the narrow light of the chapel, you find the pyramid once more not as a shape to be seen, but as a structure to be inhabited. Geometry was their theology, simplicity was their revelation. But how did they pass on this knowledge, if they rejected ornament and avoided detailed written plans? And what happened to the sacred geometry when the builders were no longer monks, but hired masons? The stone is quiet, but in a Cistercian monastery it was never truly silent. Instead, it echoed with the rhythm of rules and rituals, all of which were governed not only by theology but by spatial order. To the monks of the 12th and 13th centuries, obedience was not just moral, it was architectural. This section of the story explores the transmission of geometrical knowledge within the Cistercian order, and how it passed from monastic contemplation into practical construction. If the monks rejected flamboyance, how did they build such precisely proportioned structures? If they did not write architectural treatises, how did their silent abbeys come to resonate with such mathematical clarity? The answer lies in embodied knowledge learning that was never written, but rather lived. The geometry of the rule. At the heart of every Cistercian abbey was the rule of Saint Benedict, a 6th century monastic guideline that shaped the life of Western monks. The rule prescribed a daily rhythm of ora et labora, prayer and work. Every hour, every gesture, every placement of bed, bread, and book was scheduled. Even silence was assigned a time. What does this have to do with geometry? Everything. The rule required that monastic life be lived in measured sequence. Time was divided into the canonical hours, and movement was dictated by spatial regularity. Monks awoke, processed to the church, sat in the chapter house, worked in the cloister, all according to unchanging roots and rhythms. This ritualized motion demanded equally ritualized space. Thus, the architecture had to reflect the rule itself. It had to embody order, and geometry was the only language precise enough to sustain this. It made the layout predictable, scalable, and spiritually consistent across the growing number of Cistercian foundations. Bernard of Clairvaux insisted on this regularity. His early letters to other abbots include instructions not only about theological purity, but architectural restraint. "Let there be nothing in the house of God that distracts," he wrote, "but let the structure itself be an act of obedience." What emerged was a Cistercian blueprint, an unwritten, often unacknowledged design standard that guided abbey construction across Europe. Whether in Burgundy or Portugal, Ireland or Poland, the proportions of nave to choir, dormitory to refectory, followed familiar mathematical rules. One of the most widely used geometrical tools in this process was the harmonic canon, a system of proportions based on whole number ratios. Rooted in Pythagorean theory, this system divided space into harmonious intervals just as musical notes can be divided into pleasing chords. Architectural historians studying Fontfroid Abbey in southern France have discovered that many of its core dimensions follow these ratios exactly. Nave width to height, 1 square root 2. Cloister square to arcade height, 1, 1. Chapel bays spaced at intervals of 1, 2. These were not ad hoc measurements. They were moral decisions. A poorly proportioned space was considered not merely unattractive, it was spiritually unfit. The builders behind the stones. But who was actually doing this measuring? By the early 13th century, the scale and complexity of monastic construction had outgrown the capabilities of the monks alone. While the lay brothers, monastic members who did manual labor, were often involved in quarrying and carrying materials, the design and precision stonework increasingly fell to professional masons. And this is where two streams of knowledge began to converge. The Cistercian ideal of sacred proportion and the stonemasons' craft tradition of rope-based geometry found common ground in the construction lodges that accompanied large building projects. These lodges, located near building sites, were often multi-generational schools of practical geometry. Apprentices learned to draw using compasses and straightedges. They memorized the 3-4-5 triangle for right angles. They were trained to understand space visually and tactically, not theoretically. Many of these masons were itinerant. They traveled from abbey to abbey, often working on multiple Cistercian foundations in a single career. With them, they carried tracing boards, templates, and most importantly, shared geometry. This is how similar proportions appeared in abbeys built hundreds of miles apart. One curious phenomenon observed by researchers is the geometrical script, a series of lines and patterns used by medieval builders to organize space without blueprints. These shapes, overlapping triangles, circles, and root rectangles, could be used to generate floor plans, elevation profiles, and window placements. Though few examples survive, some faint chalk marks on the tracing floors of abbeys like Maulbronn and Fossanova offer glimpses of this hidden language. Interestingly, while this knowledge was practical, it was never considered profane. The Masons, though secular, often shared the monks' belief that geometry was divinely inspired. Some even took on minor vows during the years they worked at abbeys, eating and sleeping under the same rhythm. This convergence of manual labor and spiritual alignment formed a kind of unspoken covenant, a geometry of obedience, where every ratio measured was also a prayer. Triangles in the silence. Among the most subtly employed forms in Cistercian architecture was the triangle. You won't find pyramids in Cistercian buildings. You won't see triangular pediments or overt symbols. But the triangle was hidden everywhere, in roof pitches, in vault ribs, in the tension of pointed arches. The triangle, particularly the equilateral and isosceles, was favored for its inherent stability and symbolism. For example, the pointed arch, a defining feature of Gothic and Cistercian churches, can be formed by the intersection of two circles, with centers set at a distance equal to the radius. This construction method yields an arch that is not only structurally stronger than the Roman semicircle, but also forms a perfect triangle of thrust. Force is directed downward, then outward, forming a balanced system of support. Architectural historian Georges Duby once remarked that Cistercian abbeys are triangular in intention, built from the base upward in ascending simplicity. The triangle becomes, in a way, the spiritual ascent made material. And when light enters through the narrow lancet windows, it falls in angular bands, further reinforcing the triangle's presence. At Abbaye de Saint-Nic, for example, The dormitory windows are placed in such a way that the rising sun creates isosceles beams of light across the stone walls during matins. The monks may not have known the exact angle in degrees, but they knew, by experience, when it was right. Echoes of Egypt. We return briefly to the ancient past. Though the Cistercians would never admit it, their deep commitment to sacred proportion echoes certain elements of Egyptian temple design. The idea that architecture should mirror celestial order, that ritual movement through space can transform consciousness, and that specific ratios hold symbolic weight, all connect Cistercian thought to ancient traditions. Consider the pyramid as a symbol not just of burial but of cosmic ascent. In Cistercian abbeys, the pyramid is not built in mass but suggested in light, movement, and proportion. The triangular vaults, the ascending nave, the converging ribs all point upward. But unlike Egyptian temples built for the elite, Cistercian architecture was for a community of silence. The pyramid was not a monument, it was a path. One walked daily. Which brings us to a paradox. The monks who distrusted image, who fled worldly complexity, ended up building some of the most mathematically precise and spiritually charged spaces in Europe. They became the silent heirs of a sacred tradition they would have rejected if named geometry as mysticism. But was this intentional? Did the Cistercians know they were echoing older systems? Or did they, in seeking purity, rediscover truths forgotten by time? It is dusk in Fontenay. The soft light leans long across the stone floor of the old abbey church, catching the edge of a ribbed vault and casting a shadow shaped like a blade of light. There are no murals, no relics, no gilded saints, just stone, just shape, just silence. And yet it speaks across centuries with a language that was once sacred, geometry. We've traced the rise of Cistercian architecture, from its origins in the rigorous spiritual rule of Bernard of Clairvaux, to its embrace of austere, mathematically guided design. We've followed the tools of the builders' compasses, ropes, and tracing floors, and seen how lay brothers and masons encoded proportions into every beam and buttress. But what became of this vision? This final section explores the fate of the Cistercian geometric tradition, its echoes in later architecture, and the quiet persistence of sacred shape in a world increasingly governed by utility and spectacle. The turning point, from proportion to ornament. By the end of the 13th century, Cistercian restraint began to loosen. While early abbeys followed strict proportional systems and avoided all figurative decoration, later ones began to reflect the changing spirit of the Gothic age. As trade increased and towns grew, abbeys became wealthier, and with wealth came influence and temptation. In abbeys like Valois and Rougemont, we see the beginning of architectural drift. Window tracery becomes more elaborate, vaults are decorated with carved bosses, altars become more prominent and painted. The humble triangle gives way to the ornate ogee arch. The earlier reverence for simplicity, clarity, and symbolic proportion began to fade. This was not betrayal, it was evolution, but it marked a loss of the deep geometric consciousness that once governed every stone. The monks were no longer the sole curators of meaning. The masons continued their craft, but increasingly for clients who valued spectacle. At the same time, masonry guilds across Europe were formalizing. The itinerant stonemasons who had built the Cistercian abbeys began to form early craft fraternities, some of which would eventually evolve into the Freemasons of later centuries. These guilds preserved fragments of the sacred geometry tradition, though often cloaked in allegory and ritual. They spoke of the master builder, the sacred compass, the temple of the soul, all echoes of the Cistercian worldview, filtered through evolving contexts. Meanwhile, the monastic orders themselves entered decline. The Black Death in the 14th century ravaged monastic communities. Political upheaval further eroded their autonomy. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century swept away entire networks of monasteries across northern Europe. Buildings were looted, burned, repurposed. Many Cistercian abbeys fell to ruin. Their geometry, once so meticulously planned, was shattered, both literally and symbolically. The triangle, the root ratio, the silent vault all cracked or ignored. Yet something survived. The whisper of the stones. Despite centuries of decay, many Cistercian abbeys remained structurally intact, a testament to their geometric design. When other buildings collapsed from irregular forces or poor planning, these abbeys endured, silently holding their shape. This endurance inspired a slow rediscovery. In the 19th century, during the Romantic movement, a wave of architects and historians became fascinated with the medieval past. Among them was the French architect Eugene Viollet-le-Duc, who restored or reimagined many Gothic structures. Though controversial in method, he respected the mathematical harmony of early ecclesiastical architecture. He wrote extensively on medieval builders' use of geometry not only for strength, but for meaning. Later, in the 20th and 21st centuries, architectural archaeologists began to revisit Cistercian sites with new tools. Laser scanning, photogrammetry, and digital modeling revealed just how deliberately proportioned these abbeys were. At Le Thorinet, for example, researchers found that the entire layout was based on a square module that could be subdivided into rectangles and triangles with precise ratios. The placement of doorways, windows, and even benches followed a master grid. Nothing was random. The space was a diagram of devotion. And in this revelation, a new appreciation began to grow not only for the aesthetics of these spaces, but for the worldview behind them. A return to meaning. Today, Cistercian geometry is studied not only by historians, but by architects, spiritual seekers, and engineers. The quiet elegance of these spaces has become a model for those seeking to build places of reflection and restoration, spaces that invite stillness in a noisy world. Some modern monasteries, such as the Abbey of Our Lady of New Clairvaux in California, consciously emulate Cistercian proportions. Architects now speak of sacred ratios and design chapels using harmonic modules, just as the early monks did. In a digital age, these medieval techniques are being modeled by software, not to copy the past, but to recover its principles. And beyond the architectural world, the symbolism of the triangle and pyramid continues to resonate. Yoga studios, meditation centers, and modern cathedrals often reference ascending forms in their structures. The pyramid, long associated with ancient Egypt, is now used globally as a symbol of inner clarity, a shape that centers and lifts the spirit. While few remember the exact proportions used at Fontenay or Le Thorinet, the intention behind them persists. Even in secular architecture, the Cistercian idea that form should serve inner transformation has quietly influenced modern design. Think of the simple lines of Tadao Ando, the monastic geometry of John Pawson, or the contemplative spaces of Peter Zumthor. All echo, consciously or not, the legacy of sacred geometry in silence. The forgotten builders. And yet, the names of the builders are mostly gone. No surviving record tells us who laid the foundation stones at Saint-Ench, who calculated the span of the vault at Thorinet, who traced the triangle that governed Fontenay's cloister walk. Their work was anonymous. Their knowledge passed hand to hand, voice to voice, in the unwritten curriculum of the sacred craft. What remains is their vision hidden in ratios, silent in form. They believed that to build was to pray in stone, that to use geometry rightly was to align with the divine. They believed that simplicity was not lack, but presence. And above all, they believed that if a building was made in perfect proportion, it would outlast memory, carrying its message forward even when words failed. A final thought. The Cistercians didn't set out to echo the pyramids of Egypt. They likely never spoke of them. But the result was the same. A geometry that outlived empires, that resisted fire and time, that preserved a way of seeing the world. A pyramid is not only a monument, it is a way of thinking. A triangle is not only a shape, it is a path. So we return, one last time, to the abbey floor, to the ribbed vault above, to the quiet angles of stone warmed by late sun. And we ask, in an age obsessed with speed and spectacle, can we still build with the patience of monks, the clarity of triangles, and the humility of silence? Story 4. The Pyramidal Blueprint of Durham Cathedral. The river curves tightly below the hill. The Wear, flowing cold and slow through northern England, bends protectively around a rise where stone towers reach toward the sky. It is 1093. Norman England is still raw. The conquest is recent. Castles are rising. Rebellions simmer. And on this hill, a building begins: Durham Cathedral. It is not yet the monument we know today. It begins as a shell of stone and scaffolding. But even in these early days, the blueprint that shapes it is not merely functional. It is hierarchical, pyramidal, cosmic. This is not accidental. It is the fusion of Norman military ambition with monastic mathematical order, a design that will influence architecture across Britain for centuries to come. Durham Cathedral stands as one of the earliest surviving examples of Romanesque architecture in England, with forms that flirt daringly with the later Gothic style. But beneath its style, its vaults, and its columns lies a structure of thought, a geometrical matrix, built on ancient ideas about balance, elevation, and sacred ascent. This story begins not with an architect, but with a saint. A cathedral for a body. Durham Cathedral was built to house the relics of Saint Cuthbert, a 7th century monk and hermit of Lindisfarne whose remains were said to be incorruptible. His cult had grown immensely in the centuries following his death. The monks of Lindisfarne, fleeing Viking raids, carried his body from site to site, eventually settling in Durham in 995. By the 11th century, Cuthbert's shrine had become a powerful pilgrimage site. But the building that housed him was modest. The Norman king William II and his appointed Bishop William of St. Calais envisioned something far grander, a structure that would not only protect the saint's body but elevate his spiritual legacy in form and in stone. The decision to build on a steep promontory overlooking a looping river was strategic. Defensible, yes, but also symbolic. In medieval cosmology, elevation represented holiness. Just as Mount Sinai and Mount Tabor had been places of divine encounter, so too would this sacred hill become a spiritual axis, with Cuthbert's shrine at its center. The site, as it turned out, lent itself naturally to a pyramidal spatial hierarchy, broad at the base, narrowing upward, culminating in a central tower that would eventually rise nearly 66 meters above the river. The geometry of Norman might. The Normans were not subtle builders. Their churches were massive, ordered, and rhythmic. Durham was no exception. Its design features an unbroken nave of 7 bays, flanked by alternating massive piers and compound columns. At first glance, the space is heavy, thick, dense with structure. But this density conceals an underlying elegance. The entire plan of Durham Cathedral follows a grid based on modular ratios. The bay spacing, pier diameter, and vault heights are all derivatives of a single unit. This is a hallmark of Romanesque rationalism, a belief that repetition of form was both beautiful and moral. The building becomes a visual chant, stone echoing stone, in a kind of liturgical geometry. More importantly, Durham contains one of the earliest known uses of ribbed vaulting in the Western world. Though commonly associated with later Gothic architecture, the experimental rib vaults in Durham's nave predate their more famous use in northern France. These ribs aren't just engineering. They form a web of triangles, pointed arches meeting at precise angles, transferring weight downward and outward. If you look upward from the nave floor, you'll see what appears to be a flattened, inverted pyramid, a ceiling divided into nested triangles, culminating in the central spine of the vault. Some historians believe these vaults were inspired by earlier Islamic and Byzantine techniques, transmitted to Europe through contact in Sicily or Spain. Others see a more local evolution. Regardless, the triangle both in elevation and plan becomes a defining motif. The nave's width-to-height ratio follows a 2:1 harmonic proportion, grounding the entire space in an architectural logic of ascension. The arcades, galleries, and clerestory levels form a stepped pyramid of space, lifting the eye and the soul upward, tier by tier. And at the crossing, the heart of the building, stands the central tower, the apex of the pyramid. It was not completed until the 15th century, but the original plan called for a vertical emphasis here from the beginning. The Norman builders understood that space could shape devotion. To walk into the cathedral was to walk into a mountain of God, made visible in stone. Sacred ascent in everyday stone. But the power of Durham Cathedral is not merely in its monumentality. It lies in how ordinary geometry is transfigured into something transcendent. The use of the 3-4-5 triangle, the simplest Pythagorean form, is evident in the layout of the east end. Measurements from surviving plans and structural analysis suggest that the choir length, transept width, and crossing square follow a triple ratio. This triangle was not just efficient. It was symbolic, used in medieval times to represent the Holy Trinity, as well as the harmony of the cosmos. In medieval scholasticism, the number 3 represented unity through diversity: Father, Son, Spirit, body, soul, mind. The triangle was not only mathematical, it was theological. That theological symbolism extends even to the placement of Cuthbert's shrine, which was aligned with both liturgical east and the architectural center of the apse. Pilgrims would arrive at the western portal and be drawn forward, upward, and inward toward the shrine at the eastern apex of the cathedral's symbolic pyramid. And as they moved through the space, they would pass beneath vaults supported by ribs that formed intersecting arches, creating a succession of nested triangles, drawing their gaze toward the heavens. This, then, was the secret: to embed sacred geometry not in overt symbols, but in the very shape of space itself. Durham Cathedral becomes not a sermon in stone, but a structure for transformation, one that changes the soul by changing its orientation in space. The tension between earth and heaven. Despite its geometrical harmony, Durham is not serene. Its style reflects the tension of its time. The Norman conquest of England was still fresh when construction began. The cathedral is fortified in more ways than one. Its thick piers and buttresses speak of defense, not delicacy. The hilltop location is as much military as spiritual. And yet the geometry of the space insists on something else: light, elevation, transcendence. The triangle, though hidden in ribs and ratios, becomes a counterpoint to the mass, a whisper of heaven in the weight of earth. Durham is a study in contrasts: massive yet rising, defensive yet devotional, heavy yet aspiring. And it is in this very contrast that its geometry speaks loudest. For medieval builders, the triangle was not just a tool, it was a resolution, a way to bridge opposites: flesh and spirit, chaos and order, conquest and contemplation. Durham still stands. Its stone ribs still stretch above pilgrims and tourists alike. Its vaults still cast triangular shadows on ancient flags. Its shrine, though changed, is still a place of veneration. And yet the question remains: did the builders know what they were creating? Did they understand they were encoding a pyramid in air, a structure for the soul? Or were they, like the pilgrims who walked beneath, simply following a plan too large to see? Morning sun filters through the high clerestory of Durham Cathedral, casting angled shadows across the floor. The vaults above, intricate and layered, seem both immense and intimate, an impossible combination made real by design. This is no accidental architecture. The stones were shaped not only to stand, but to speak, to carry meaning in angle, rhythm, and ascent. In the first section, we explored how Durham's architectural plan, rooted in Norman Romanesque form, employed early pyramidic structure in its verticality, massing, and symbolism. Now, we move deeper, into the choir, into the crossing, and into the mathematical imagination that underpinned Durham's spiritual function. It is here, in the east end of the cathedral, that the pyramidal blueprint becomes not just a spatial concept, but a liturgical one. Building toward the shrine. At the heart of Durham Cathedral's design is a progression, a spatial and spiritual journey from the west entrance to the east end, culminating in the shrine of St. Cuthbert. This journey is physically linear, but geometrically hierarchical. Each step brings the pilgrim closer to the apex of the sacred pyramid. The central nave begins wide and tall, and the elevation increases subtly, marked by ribbed vaulting. As one approaches the choir, the proportions tighten. The architecture narrows and lifts, drawing attention to the eastward pull. This movement was not simply aesthetic, it was theological. The East was associated with resurrection, divine origin, and liturgical fulfillment. The very plan of the cathedral follows the sun's path, a cosmic orientation encoded in stone. The choir was rebuilt in the 13th century in the Gothic style, a transition from the earlier Romanesque. But this shift was not merely stylistic, it was mathematically conscious. The rib vaults in the choir are no longer simple barrel arches. They form pointed arches and tiercering vaults, with supplementary ribs that create triangular subdivisions within each bay. From below, the vaults appear to fan outward and upward, like petals or wings. But when analyzed geometrically, they resolve into isosceles and equilateral triangles, fitted within the square bay modules of the choir floorplan. This system is not decorative. It governs force, space, and light. The ribbed vault is a triangle of tension. Its ribs distribute weight downward into the piers, relieving the walls of pressure and allowing for greater windows. But beyond this engineering function, the triangular web above the choir enacts a spiritual metaphor, ascending order, with each rib an extension of a central truth. A sacred plan and ratios. Durham's layout adheres closely to modular geometric planning, where each element derives from a base unit. Analysis of the plan reveals recurring ratios. 1:2 between bay width and height. 3:4 between nave height and crossing vaults. 5:8, a common Fibonacci ratio, appearing in transept widths. But what makes Durham exceptional is the deliberate use of these ratios to build a visual pyramid, a structure that rises tier by tier, physically and symbolically. The vertical elevation from floor to clerestory window follows a tripartite model. The arcade, lower arches. The gallery or triforium. The clerestory. These three levels create a pyramidal rhythm: a base, a middle, and an apex. Each successive tier is narrower and more open, culminating in windows that release light downward like divine illumination. The shape is echoed in the cross-section. A wide base, narrowing upward, a triangle built of air and stone. At the center of this composition lies the crossing, where the nave and transept intersect beneath the great central tower. This square space is both architectural and theological center. From it, lines radiate outward like a compass: north, south, east, west, framing the cathedral as a cosmic axis, a microcosm of heavenly order. Cuthbert's shrine, originally placed behind the high altar, was therefore not just spatially significant, but geometrically central. The shrine formed the apex of the spiritual pyramid, the summit of ascent. Triangular symbolism in the detail. Though Durham lacks the florid ornamentation of high Gothic cathedrals, its decorative stonework still contains geometric motifs carved quietly into capitals, arch moldings, and ceiling bosses. For example, the crossing vault bosses form interlocking triangles, some with concentric circles inscribed within, possibly referencing the Trinity or celestial spheres. The north aisle ceiling includes keystones with trefoil patterns, three-lobed forms, based on equilateral triangle geometry. Even the floor tiles of the choir once formed repeating geometric patterns, some arranged in hexagons built from triangles. Each of these reflects the belief that divine truth was embedded in structure. Geometry was not decoration, it was doctrine. In medieval education, geometry was part of the quadrivium, the four advanced liberal arts, alongside arithmetic, music, and astronomy. All four were believed to be reflections of the mind of God, accessible through reason. A cathedral, in this sense, was a material quadrivium, music in its chant, arithmetic in its measures, astronomy in its orientation, and geometry in its form. Triangles in sound and light. One of Durham Cathedral's most overlooked dimensions is its acoustics shaped by geometry. The rib vaults and high elevation create reverberation patterns that amplify Gregorian chant, especially in the choir. Sound ascends and returns in waves. Studies have shown that the choir's vault dimensions amplify specific harmonic intervals, particularly perfect fifths and fourths musical ratios that map directly onto triangular geometry. Light, too, follows triangular logic. At certain times of year, sunlight enters the south clerestory and cuts across the nave in an angled beam, striking the opposite wall in a perfect diagonal, drawing a line from clerestory to aisle, apex to base. These pyramid shadows trace the invisible geometry of the building as the earth turns. In this way, the building becomes a solar instrument, measuring the divine through natural light. A memory carved in mass. As the Middle Ages waned, the pyramidal blueprint of Durham was rarely replicated. Later Gothic cathedrals in England like York or Exeter preferred verticality for its own sake, pushing toward height rather than proportion. Baroque and Renaissance churches abandoned geometric consistency in favor of spectacle and perspective. Durham remained an anomaly, a fusion of Norman mass and mystical measure, built by masons who understood that a building could be a diagram of the soul. Even today, with tourists streaming through and electric lighting installed, the underlying geometry still reveals itself to those who pause to notice. A triangle traced by ribs, a pyramid formed by elevation, a shrine placed at the apex of a great square, a river flowing around a hill like a compass. Durham is more than medieval, it is eternal through structure. But how did the masons pass this geometry on? Where did the knowledge go when the builders died? Was it preserved, altered, forgotten? Even the stone remembers. You walk the nave of Durham Cathedral and feel, more than see, the order beneath your feet. It is not shouted from the walls but whispered through their balance. Ratios, triangles, elevations, these were the tools of the builders. And though most of their names are gone, their ideas endure, resting silently in the geometry of the place. In this final section, we close the story of Durham by asking, who preserved this geometry? What happened to the knowledge behind the pyramid-like structure embedded in this sacred hilltop? And finally, how has it endured quietly across centuries that changed the world around it? The Master Masons, names behind the ratios. The original Master Mason of Durham Cathedral is believed to have been Gundulf of Rochester, a monk architect who had previously worked on other Norman projects in England. Though he may not have directed every detail of Durham, his influence shaped the early phase of construction, particularly in how Norman architectural forms were adapted into a monumental yet measured expression. After Gundulf, a succession of masons took over the building project. Some names appear briefly in documents: Turgot, Richard the engineer, others simply as Master of Works. They directed teams of stonemasons, carpenters, and laborers, many of whom were illiterate, yet deeply literate in geometric form. These masons did not write books. They worked with tools and tracing floors, drawing out floor plans on smoothed plaster using rope compasses, wooden templates, and straightedges. The knowledge was passed through apprenticeship and imitation, not through theory. A master would show the apprentice how to divide a square, how to derive a triangle from a circle, how to find a golden section using only a knotted cord. This oral and visual tradition persisted for centuries, but it was fragile. As architectural styles changed in the later Middle Ages, and as literacy became more tied to universities rather than guilds, the Masonic knowledge of sacred geometry began to fragment. Some of it flowed into the emerging Freemasonic traditions of the 16th and 17th centuries. Though these groups often reinvented their own origins, they retained symbolic references to the tools and symbols of the medieval Mason's compass, square, triangle, and the all-seeing eye itself, a triangular motif. But even among Freemasons, the practical, architectural use of sacred geometry was gradually replaced by moral allegory. The cathedral, once a literal pyramid in space, became a metaphor for self-improvement, for moral construction. The triangle remained but as symbol, not as structure. The invisible triangle in the Renaissance and after. During the Renaissance, architects like Leon Battista Alberti and Leonardo da Vinci revived classical proportions. The triangle re-emerged, but now framed within Vitruvian principles seeking harmony between architecture and the proportions of the human body. These ideas owed something to the medieval builders of places like Durham, but the lineage was indirect. The chain of transmission had frayed. In England, Durham remained a relic, admired more for its massiveness than its mathematical clarity. As Gothic gave way to Tudor, and later Baroque, the concept of spatial theology of shaping a building to mirror a cosmic pyramid fell out of fashion. Geometry was still used, but no longer as an expression of divine order. It was employed for function, symmetry, or theatrical illusion. The Enlightenment valued reason over mystery, clarity over mysticism. The triangle was still drawn, but not revered. The pyramid, once the spiritual architecture of the cosmos, became a tool of empire, engraved on currency and monuments as a symbol of hierarchy and power. And yet Durham endured. The triangle, though no longer taught, remained embedded in the stones. Rediscovery and quiet reverence. By the 19th century, antiquarians and early architectural historians began to study Durham with fresh eyes. John Ruskin, though more enamored with the Gothic of Venice, recognized in Durham a gravity of form drawn upward by unseen hands. Others, like Thomas Rickman, helped classify English medieval architecture into phases: Norman, Early English, decorated, of which Durham became a cornerstone example. But it wasn't until the 20th century that scholars began to explore the mathematical planning behind medieval churches in earnest. Researchers like Robert Branner and Erwin Panofsky traced the use of geometric schemes across cathedrals, showing how triangles, circles, and root rectangles had governed design far more consciously than previously thought. In Durham, these discoveries came slowly. Careful measurements of the vaulting patterns, bay divisions, and tower elevations confirmed what the Masons never wrote. The building is full of triangles not for decoration, but for stability, clarity, and meaning. Architectural analysis of Durham's crossing vaults, for instance, reveals a consistent use of Pythagorean triangles in the spacing and springing of ribs. The plan of the eastern apse aligns closely with a golden triangle, a rare form where the ratio of the legs matches the golden ratio, 1:618. These findings suggest not mere intuition, but intentional design guided by geometrical rules. The Masons had not built blindly. They had built with knowledge inherited, practiced, and preserved not in books, but in stone memory. The modern eye. Today, few who visit Durham recognize the triangles above them. Most see the size, the age, the grandeur. Few are still pause to consider the plan: the triangle hidden beneath the ribs, the pyramid formed by space. But a quiet revival is underway. Contemporary architects, especially those working in sacred or contemplative spaces, are once again looking to Durham and places like it not to copy, but to recover intent. In a world of noise, the silent authority of proportion offers something different. Courses on sacred geometry are taught again not only in esoteric circles, but in design schools. Architects study the modular rhythms of Durham, the spatial hierarchy of its nave, the angles of its light. The triangle, long buried in stone, rises again as an idea. And in Durham itself, the pilgrimage to Cuthbert's shrine continues. Though the shrine was destroyed during the Reformation, a new tomb was installed in the 20th century, restoring a kind of access to the East End. Pilgrims still walk toward it, tracing the old path, guided by space, not sermon. They walk the pyramid, even if they do not know it. A reflection in stone. The story of Durham Cathedral is not simply one of conquest, architecture, or theology. It is a story about form and how humans use form to understand what cannot be seen. The triangle was chosen not because it is strong, but because it converges, it leads upward, it narrows toward clarity, it points beyond. Durham was built with this idea in mind, that a building could be a path, and that geometry could teach as much as any preacher. Its builders are gone, its vaults are patched, its light has changed. And yet the pyramid still rises not of stone, but of thought. So the question lingers. In a time when we can build anything, do we still remember how to build something that means everything? Story 5, Abbey of Cluny, Collapse of the Sacred Order. You must imagine silence, not the absence of sound, but the disciplined quiet of hundreds of monks, moving in unison, chanting in layered harmony, all beneath the highest vaults of the medieval world. This is Cluny, in the heart of Burgundy, around the year 1100, a moment when the Benedictine order stood at its height, and its mother house, the Abbey of Cluny, embodied the most ambitious architectural and spiritual vision of the Middle Ages. But Cluny's greatness was not only measured in size. It was a place where geometry and theology were married in stone, where proportion was a path to salvation, and where architectural order symbolized celestial order. This was sacred architecture writ large, massive, ordered, pyramidal in plan and thought. And yet within 2 centuries, Cluny would fall, its walls crumbling, its influence waning. In this story, we trace the rise of Cluny through the geometry of its design, specifically the vast Cluny III, the third and final major church built on the site. We will examine how it used sacred ratios, how its space was organized around triangular and pyramidal forms, and how these forms reflected the order's rise and eventual decline. A new kind of monastic power. The story begins in 910, when Duke William I of Aquitaine donated land to found a monastery that would be free from secular interference, a bold move, in an age when noble families routinely installed their sons as abbots and siphoned wealth from religious institutions. This freedom allowed Cluny to grow with rare autonomy. From this modest beginning, the Cluniac order became a spiritual empire. Over the next 2 centuries, Cluny would oversee a vast network of monasteries, eventually numbering over 1,400 subordinate houses. It set the liturgical pace for much of Europe, emphasizing grand ritual, daily choral celebration, and architectural magnificence. To house this vision, the abbots of Cluny commissioned 3 successive churches. Cluny III, begun in 1088 under Abbot Hugh of Seymour, was the apex. It would become the largest church in Christendom, a title it held until the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in the 16th century. But Cluny III was more than large. It was structured, planned, symbolic, and at its heart lay a geometry of hierarchy and ascent. A pyramid of spaces. Cluny III was shaped like a cross, yes, but beneath that, its plan was pyramidal in conception. From the vast western entrance to the enclosed apse at the far east, each space was ordered to escalate in sanctity and spatial focus. Let's imagine the structure in simplified form. The narthex, or entrance, marked the base of space for the laity and penitent. Beyond lay the five-aisled nave, broad and rhythmic, where monks processed in chant. At the crossing rose the central tower, capped with a pyramidal spire. This was the visual apex. Radiating from the choir were double transepts and an elaborate chevet, Eastern chapels. At the far end stood the high altar, and behind it, the reliquaries and sacred relics, the spiritual summit. This spatial organization mirrored not only a theological hierarchy, sinner to saint, lay to cleric, but a geometrical ascent. Cluny III's plan can be analyzed as a series of nested rectangles and triangles, each module building upon the last, guiding the pilgrim forward and upward. The length of the nave, for instance over 180 meters, was broken into bays based on proportional units. Each bay was defined by piers forming triangular arches, and the vaulting above created a rhythmic series of pointed forms, narrowing toward the choir. The result was an internal movement, a pyramid in reverse, an invisible slope formed not by mass, but by spatial progression. Geometry as devotion. Cluny's builders were not mere craftsmen, they were theological geometers. The monks believed that space, when properly measured, could reflect the harmony of God's creation. And so the structure of Cluny III was not just engineered, it was composed like music. Some scholars suggest that Cluny's architects followed a modular planning system, likely based on a base unit of measurement derived from the human body, an early nod to what would later be called anthropometric architecture. From this module, they generated the dimensions of aisles, columns, chapels, and even window spacing. The vertical proportions of Cluny III reflect common sacred ratios. The width of the nave to its height approximates 1 square root 2, the dynamic rectangle. The spacing of the transepts follows 2, 3, a musical interval known as the perfect fifth. The choir's plan forms a centralized triangle, a shape echoed in the vault ribs and the high apse windows. Triangle after triangle, some literal, some implied, formed the logic of the structure. And geometry wasn't restricted to ground plans. The vaulting of Cluny III was complex, layered, and triangulated. Sexpartite vaults, divided into 6 cells by intersecting ribs, formed a skeletal ceiling that again reflected the pyramid, base to peak, with the ribs pulling inward and upward toward clerestory windows that filtered divine light. Light as structure. Cluny was designed to glow. Its architecture guided not only bodies but sunlight. Morning liturgy began before sunrise. By the time of prime, the sun was cresting the eastern windows, sending beams across the high altar. These windows, placed within the conical half-dome of the apse, radiated light downward in angled shafts, once again tracing triangular forms. The octagonal lantern tower at the crossing served as a central eye, admitting light downward like an oculus. As monks passed beneath, chanting the divine office, the geometry of their voices and the geometry of light intersected in space. This was more than spectacle, it was theology in stone and light. But such precision demanded discipline. Cluny's architecture was a direct reflection of its monastic rule: long hours of prayer, exact routines, hierarchy, 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 geometry as obedience. And herein lay the paradox. The very system that made Cluny strong would one day become its weakness. The cost of sacred order. To sustain this architecture, to build, maintain, and preserve a structure so vast required vast resources. Cluny was wealthy, supported by kings and nobles, but its order grew increasingly complex, top-heavy, and centralized. Critics accused the monks of being more administrators than ascetics. In time, other orders rose in response. The Cistercians, for instance, who rejected ornament and hierarchy, seeking simplicity and silence. We met them in Story 3. To them, Cluny's grandeur had become vanity. Even as Cluny's monks added decoration, towers, and frescoes, the world around them was changing. Power was decentralizing. Pilgrimage routes shifted. The Gothic style, with its light and verticality, overtook the massive Romanesque. What once seemed divine permanence began to feel burdensome. By the 14th century, Cluny was in decline. Wars, plagues, and debt took their toll. The final blow came during the French Revolution, when the abbey was seized, sold, and systematically dismantled. Today, only a fraction of Cluny III survives. A transept, a few chapels, the entrance. The triangle collapsed. The pyramid fell. And yet what lingers? Fragments of Cluny's geometry remain. Ground plans survive. Archival sketches record the proportions. Scholars reconstruct its dimensions, tracing virtual pyramids in space where stone no longer stands. And in that process they ask, can a building built to express eternal order still speak after it has fallen? Was Cluny's collapse a failure of geometry, or a reminder that even sacred proportions cannot escape history? Cluny fell slowly, not with the drama of invasion or fire, though both would come, but with the slow erasure of relevance. The pyramid it had once represented, geometrically and spiritually, began to disintegrate from the top down. Like an abandoned structure in time-lapse, the great Benedictine abbey unraveled in ritual, then in rule, then in stone. And yet the shape of its fall mirrored its rise. Cluny's collapse was as structured as its construction. It happened in proportional phases, just as its vaults had risen in careful modules. In this section, we explore the mechanisms of this decline, how a sacred geometry became a burden, how architectural order invited reform, and how, even amid decay, the memory of a pyramidal ideal persisted. The strain of centralized order. By the mid-12th century, Cluny was an empire unto itself. Its abbot ruled over hundreds of priories across Europe, and its influence extended into royal courts and papal politics. But empires, even spiritual ones, must administer themselves, and administration requires structure. The very thing that had made Cluny's strong centralization began to create strain. The abbot of Cluny was the sole superior of every Cluniac house, a role that worked when the order had a dozen priories, but became impossible when there were hundreds. Delegation was not part of the original system, and changes were slow. Messages could take weeks to arrive. The geometry of hierarchy became overly rigid. Financial pressure mounted. Cluny's liturgy was long, elaborate, and expensive. The monks' days were filled with continuous worship, up to 10 services per day, which left little time for manual labor. This was a marked difference from earlier Benedictine ideals. Cluny's monks relied on donations and lay brothers to support them. To outsiders, this began to look like decadence. By the late 11th century, Cluny's critics were growing louder. Reform movements, most notably the Cistercians, began to push back against Cluny's opulence. The Cistercians favored simple, austere architecture, emphasizing manual labor and silence. Their buildings were intentionally unadorned, rejecting the very geometric grandeur that Cluny embodied. The contrast was stark. Cluny built upward in pyramidal complexity. The Cistercians built downward into humility and horizontalism. In architectural terms, Cluny represented sacred hierarchy, while the Cistercians pursued sacred parity. Gothic displacement. The Gothic style also contributed to Cluny's gradual decline, not just artistically, but symbolically. Gothic architecture represented a new kind of geometry. It embraced height, yes, but through skeletal lightness and pointed arches, not mass. It used flying buttresses, large windows, and ribbed vaults that emphasized vertical pull over central gravity. Gothic cathedrals like Chartres, Amiens, and Reims expressed a different kind of sacred order, one based not on monastic seclusion, but on urban participation. These were civic churches as much as sacred ones. The world was coming inside. In this new architectural language, Cluny began to feel old-fashioned. Its thick walls, small windows, and low-light interiors stood in contrast to the illuminated glass of Gothic spaces. Worse, the very scale of Cluny became its enemy. The church was so massive, its nave over 180 meters long, its towers soaring more than 30 meters, that it became hard to maintain, especially during periods of war and economic hardship. By the 14th century, parts of the abbey were physically deteriorating, and repairs were delayed. The geometric harmony once maintained by daily care began to fade, stone by stone. The 100 Years, War and Internal Fracture. During the 100 Years' War 1337–1453, Cluny suffered repeated incursions and instability. Though not a battlefield itself, it lay within contested Burgundy and saw its income decline as tenants fled, lands were ravaged, and trade was disrupted. More damaging was the Black Death, 1347–1351, which decimated the population, including the monastic ranks. With fewer monks, Cluny's liturgical regimen was disrupted. Without the full choir, the divine office lost its grandeur, and so too did its purpose. At this time, less than half the monastic offices were fully chanted, and many Cluniac houses fell into disrepair. The daily rhythm of prayer, once Cluny's lifeblood, became fragmented. The geometry of worship, the cycle of hours, the symmetry of days began to unravel. Efforts at reform sputtered. Various abbots tried to reassert order, but internal divisions and external pressures made such reform difficult. The Avignon papacy and the Western Schism further undercut the Church's unity. Cluny's authority, once a stable triangle of order, now became a web of uncertain allegiances. The spiritual pyramid was tilting. The Revolution's final blow. And then came the French Revolution, 1789. In a wave of anti-clerical fervor, monasteries across France were suppressed. Cluny, as a symbol of ecclesiastical power and aristocratic association, became a target. In 1790, the abbey was nationalized. Its monks were dispersed. Its vast library was scattered or destroyed. The building itself was sold to a developer for quarry stone. Over the next decades, most of Cluny III was systematically dismantled. Its towers were pulled down, its vaults collapsed, its transepts exploded with black powder. The stone that had once formed sacred angles now paved roads and lined barns. By 1823, nearly 90% of the original structure was gone. All that remains today are fragments. A section of the southern transept, one tower, portions of the cloister and chapter house, some surviving plans and engravings. The pyramid, once the largest sacred structure in Europe, was reduced to a ruin. Echoes in the ground. Yet even in ruin, Cluny's geometry endures. Archaeological excavations in the 20th and 21st centuries have mapped the outlines of Cluny III's original footprint. Using foundations, surviving columns, and digital modeling, scholars have reconstructed the full scale of the abbey. And what they found was astonishing. The choir and chevet were larger than many entire cathedrals. The westwork, or western facade, had two massive towers, and a narthex nearly the size of a cathedral nave. The central crossing was flanked by additional towers, forming a vertical spine that echoed the ascending hierarchy of heaven. The floorplan reveals a nested system of equilateral triangles, used to divide space, align sightlines, and structure sacred procession. Even after centuries of destruction, the underlying proportions remain visible. Cluny's geometry is like a fossil pressed into the ground, waiting to be read. So what can we learn from the collapse of such perfect order? Perhaps that geometry alone is not enough, that even sacred architecture must adapt, that a pyramid once formed must remain responsive to the world around it. Or perhaps Cluny's fall simply reminds us of the impermanence of perfection. What happens when the form outlasts the faith? Cluny is mostly gone. Its massive church, once the heart of monastic Europe, is now a quiet archaeological site in the countryside of Burgundy. But something lingers beyond the ruins, beyond the broken vaults and buried stones. There is a shape still present, though invisible. A geometry. A memory. In this final section, we explore the afterlife of Cluny, how its architectural ideas survived even as the walls fell, how its legacy passed into liturgical rhythm, architectural proportion, and modern rediscovery. We'll ask whether a space built to reflect heaven can retain its meaning even when it is no longer there. The plan as memory. While the abbey itself was dismantled, Cluny's ground plan survived in partial drawings, surviving documents, and careful observation. Monks in the later Middle Ages and Renaissance had attempted to record the space, and antiquarians in the 17th and 18th centuries measured its remaining parts with growing precision. But it wasn't until the 19th century that serious efforts began to reconstruct Cluny III on paper. French architects and ecclesiastical historians, driven by the romantic desire to recover the medieval past, created hypothetical reconstructions based on surviving floor plans, archaeological remains, and comparative analysis with similar Romanesque churches. One of the most important figures in this was Charles de Gerville, a pioneer of medieval architectural study, and later Viollet-le-Duc, whose Gothic restorations shaped the French view of medieval architecture. Though neither restored Cluny in the literal sense, both helped create a cultural framework for understanding its significance. By the early 20th century, archaeologists began systematic excavations, uncovering column bases, crypt structures, and foundations that confirmed the mathematical precision of Cluny's design. They found that even hidden areas, like the crypt or side chapels, followed modular geometries, usually based on squares and triangles derived from a master ratio. It was clear Cluny had not been built freely. It had been designed with a plan, a rule, like a piece of Gregorian chant set in stone. And so, long after the walls were gone, the idea of Cluny remained. Geometry in exile. In the centuries following Cluny's fall, its geometry did not disappear, it was diffused. Many former Cluniac priories continued to exist in partial form, often absorbed into other monastic orders or turned into parish churches. These buildings retained fragments of Cluny's proportional logic, the width of a bay here, the curve of a vault there, the rhythm of a cloister walk. In this way, Cluny's architecture lived on in a diaspora of stone, scattered across Europe. Its influence was especially strong in Spain, where Cluniac monks had introduced Romanesque forms to churches along the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela. Many Spanish Romanesque buildings echo Cluny's plan and elevation, with simplified adaptations of its pyramid-like progression from nave to choir. Even as Gothic architecture replaced the Romanesque in fashion, Cluny's influence lingered in the idea of order in space. Later builders, especially during the Renaissance, returned to proportional planning, but now guided by classical ideals drawn from Vitruvius, rather than monastic practice. Still, the idea that buildings should embody harmony, that ratios matter, that geometry is a form of truth remained a Cluniac inheritance. In some ways, it was reborn. Liturgical geometry. Cluny was not only architecture, it was music. And while the church itself was dismantled, its liturgical rhythm survived longer than its stones. The Cluniac liturgy was elaborate, built on the Benedictine rule, but extended into near-constant prayer and chant. Some historians have described it as architecture in time, a spiritual pyramid formed not of bricks, but of hours. The monastic day at Cluny followed a strict cycle. Matins before dawn, lauds at sunrise, prime mid-morning, terce sext and none throughout the day, vespers at sunset, compline before sleep. Each service had specific chant settings, spatial movements, and ritual choreography. The spaces of Cluny III were designed to support this rhythm. Wide choir stalls for the monks, elevated ambulatories for processions, acoustics for layered singing. Even after the building was destroyed, this temporal architecture persisted. The Cluniac liturgical books were copied and distributed, shaping practices across Europe. And so, even as its stones were turned into fences and cellars, Cluny's proportions survived in time, in the breath and silence between psalms. Modern rediscovery and the virtual pyramid. Today, Cluny is a site of digital resurrection. Scholars and technologists have used 3D modeling and virtual reality to rebuild Cluny III digitally, using laser scans of the ruins, archaeological measurements, and medieval sources. These reconstructions allow visitors to walk through the lost church, seeing its pyramidal shape restored in pixels and light. In these reconstructions, the logic of Cluny's space becomes clear. A nave that narrows and rises, a crossing that lifts light toward a central tower, a choir that concentrates sacred presence, a progression of scale from outer aisles to inner sanctum, a plan built of equilateral triangles and golden sections. What was once implicit in stone is now explicit in code. Educational institutions in France and abroad use these models to teach not only architectural history, but the relationship between spiritual life and built form. Cluny, long dismissed as a relic, has become an object of futuristic inquiry. The pyramid rises again, but this time in memory, in measure, and in simulation. A reflection from the ruins. When you visit Cluny today, you find a field. A few towers remain. The cloister is still there, modest and shaded. You can stand at the place where the great nave once rose and try to imagine it. The chanting, the arches, the layered triangle of ritual and space. And you might wonder, was it all lost? The answer is more subtle. A building is not only its stones. It is the idea it holds, the memory it shapes, and the geometry it teaches. Cluny taught the West how to think in space, how to build not merely for shelter or spectacle, but for spiritual structure. Its fall was not failure, it was transformation. Today, architects return to Cluny for lessons in proportion. Historians return for lessons in order. Musicians return for the silence between its echoes. And perhaps, above all, we return to Cluny for a lesson in impermanence, that even the most perfect geometry cannot hold against time, but may still carry meaning through it. So we end with a question. What is more lasting, stone or the shape it once held? What in the end survives, the wall or the idea of how to build it? Story 6, Chartres Cathedral, Light, Ladders, and Labyrinths. You stand in shadow. The cool hush of a Gothic nave surrounds you. Overhead, ribs arch into vaults like the branches of petrified trees. But this is not a forest. This is Chartres Cathedral, and the silence is not empty. It is full of color. Sunlight pierces through dozens of stained glass windows, casting shards of red, blue, and gold across the flagstone floor. The light shifts with the hour, slowly tracing a hidden map. This is not accidental. This is sacred geometry. In this story, we enter the world of Chartres Cathedral, a monument to medieval light and logic. It is one of the best preserved Gothic cathedrals in Europe, and perhaps the most symbolically rich. It was here that sacred architecture became an act of optical theology. We will explore how the cathedral's design was guided by sacred ratios, numerical mysticism, and cosmic alignment, and how a single structure, rebuilt after fire, became a lens for divine understanding. A cathedral reborn from flame. The city of Chartres, about 80 kilometers southwest of Paris, has long been a sacred site. Even before Christianity, it was home to a Gallo-Roman cult of the Virgin. Early Christian churches stood here as early as the 4th century, but the structure we see today rose from destruction. In 1194, fire consumed most of the existing Romanesque cathedral. Only the crypt, the western towers, and part of the west facade survived. It was a devastating loss, but one that catalyzed a transformation. Rebuilding began almost immediately, and the resulting cathedral, completed largely by 1220, is a masterwork of the High Gothic style. And unlike many cathedrals, which took centuries to finish, Chartres was built in under 30 years, giving it a remarkable unity of design. This speed and unity allowed the architects to follow a single, cohesive vision, a vision guided not only by engineering skill, but by philosophical mathematics. The mind behind the stone. We do not know the name of the master architect who rebuilt Chartres, but we know his mind. He was a geometer as much as a builder. His cathedral is shaped by harmonic ratios, astrological orientation, and the principles of Platonic and Pythagorean thought, all common in 12th century intellectual circles, especially at Chartres Cathedral School, one of the era's great centers of learning. This intellectual climate mattered. Chartres was not just a religious center, it was a philosophical one. Here, Christian scholars studied Boethius, Plato, Pythagoras, and Euclid, believing that mathematics was a language for divine truth. Geometry wasn't just a tool, it was a path to God. They believed, as did St. Augustine, that numbers are the thoughts of God. So they used numbers not just to measure, but to reveal. And in Chartres, they built that revelation into stone. The cathedral as a book of numbers. Let's begin with the floor plan. Chartres follows the cruciform layout typical of Gothic cathedrals, but its proportions are unusually precise. The nave is 254 Roman feet long. The transept, from north to south, is also 254 Roman feet, a perfect cross. The total interior length of the cathedral, from west entrance to eastern apse, is 416 Roman feet, a number believed to reflect a multiple of sacred ratios, including 4, 1 symbol of creation, and 13, 1 symbol of Christ and his apostles. Other measurements align with symbolic numbers. The number of bays in the nave, 7, a holy number. The number of lancet windows in the choir, 12 apostles, tribes of Israel. The number of radial chapels, 7. The number of stained glass windows, over 170, often associated with the full Psalter. But most striking of all is the labyrinth, inlaid into the floor. The labyrinth, a pilgrim's geometry. At the heart of Chartres, between the third and fourth bays of the nave, lies a circular labyrinth, about 12.9 meters in diameter. It is a single winding path, nearly 300 meters long if walked from entrance to center. To a modern eye, it may seem decorative, but to a medieval pilgrim, it was a ritual journey, a miniature pilgrimage in stone, walked as a form of penance or meditation. The labyrinth has 11 concentric rings and 34 turns, forming a geometry that has been the subject of endless speculation. Some believe it encodes musical proportions. Others see astronomical symbolism, connections to lunar months, the solar calendar, or even planetary orbits. What is certain is that it follows a single path without forks or choices, one way in, one way out, a winding road to the center, symbolic of the soul's journey to God. And at the center, originally, it may have held a brass plaque depicting the Battle of Theseus and the Minotaur, a pagan myth. Yes, but one medieval thinkers reinterpreted as a metaphor for Christ defeating sin in the labyrinth of the world. It is sacred geometry in motion. Rose windows and light. Above all, Chartres is a cathedral of light. Its famous rose windows, especially the north and south transept roses, are masterpieces of both theology and geometry. The north rose, often associated with the Virgin, is composed of 12 petal-shaped lobes surrounding a central circle, a visual reflection of divine harmony. The proportions of these roses are based on geometry of the circle, a shape seen by medieval philosophers as the most perfect. because it has no beginning and no end. Light passing through the stained glass transforms geometry into experience. Unlike Cluny, where space was about mass and rhythm, Chartres is about illumination and symbolism. The deep blue glass, known as Chartres blue, was produced with cobalt and remains unmatched in hue. It casts a marine tone across the floor, making you feel as though you are underwater or inside a gem. The glass tells stories of saints, prophets, tradespeople, kings. It functions as a Biblia Pauperum, a Bible for the poor, designed for those who could not read. But even more, it functions as geometry and color. Each window is a mandala of proportions, with symbols nested in circles, framed in squares, and linked in sacred numbers. Chartres is a cathedral that teaches through form, orientation, and the cosmos. Even the orientation of the building was carefully planned. The cathedral is aligned slightly northeast, not due east, suggesting the builders were accounting for solar angles, perhaps even aligning the cathedral to the sunrise on the Feast of the Annunciation, March 25, a day associated with the conception of Christ. Some have proposed that the cathedral was oriented to astrological events, part of a broader belief that architecture could harmonize microcosm and macrocosm, the building, as a model of the universe. The 12 signs of the zodiac appear throughout the cathedral, especially on the archivolts and in the stained glass. These were not seen as pagan symbols, but as markers of divine order, part of a cosmic calendar set in motion by the Creator. Chartres, then, is a kind of sacred clock, a building that tells the time of the soul and the turning of the heavens. The hidden code. Scholars have spent centuries decoding Chartres. Some believe the cathedral encodes musical ratios, that the lengths of its bays, the heights of its towers, and the spacing of its windows correspond to intervals of the diatonic scale. Others see Platonic solids and Euclidean geometries embedded in its structure. Still others propose that the golden ratio 1:618 guides the proportions of the facade and nave. Though this is debated, it is clear that the builders were working with intentional mathematical precision. And then there are the mystical theories, some plausible, some speculative. That the cathedral was a map of Jerusalem. That its towers correspond to the pillars of Bos and Jachin from Solomon's temple. That its crypt mirrors a druidic site of worship. That the floor plan encodes the tree of life from Kabbalah. What's clear is this: Chartres was not built by accident. It was not simply a house of God, but a diagram of heaven. But this raises a deeper question. Can geometry truly express the divine? Can stone, shaped by human hands, reveal something beyond the physical? Chartres seems to suggest yes. Yet its meanings remain partially hidden, encoded in numbers, light, and myth. Like a labyrinth, it invites us to walk, to wonder, and to get lost. You return to the cathedral not in person but in thought. The light has shifted. It's afternoon now. Sunlight pours through the southern rose window, scattering gold across the flagstones. The colored shafts sweep slowly across the transept, as if the building itself is a giant sundial, keeping sacred time. Chartres was never meant to be seen all at once. It reveals itself like a manuscript, one page at a time, with margins full of symbols and allegory. In this section, we explore how Chartres became a visual expression of philosophical thought, especially that of the school of Chartres, a community of thinkers who saw geometry as the key to understanding the divine. We'll look at the people behind the cathedral, not just the stonemasons, but the intellectuals who shaped its vision. We'll trace the Platonism, Pythagoreanism, and even Neoplatonism encoded in its architecture. And we'll descend into the crypt, a shadowy space older than the cathedral itself, where ancient wisdom and Christian devotion coexisted. Because Chartres was not just built to house relics, it was built to reveal a worldview. The philosophers of Chartres. To understand the symbolism of Chartres, we must understand its intellectual climate. In the 11th and 12th centuries, the school of Chartres was among the most respected centers of learning in Europe. Though not a university in the modern sense, it was a cathedral school where scholars studied classical texts, theology, music, astronomy, and mathematics. Its thinkers were Christian humanists, men who believed that the created world reflected divine reason. Among the most notable were Bernard of Chartres, who said, "We are like dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants." Thierry of Chartres, who taught that the four elements earth, air, fire, water followed logical rules. Gilbert of Poitiers, who merged Platonic forms with Christian doctrine. These scholars believed in a rational cosmos, a world built with mathematical proportion. They took inspiration from Plato's Timaeus, where the universe is described as a living creature, constructed with geometric harmony. And so, when it came time to rebuild the cathedral, they brought that same logic to bear. Chartres was to be not just a church, but a model of cosmic order, a ladder between heaven and earth. The Platonic Cathedral. What does it mean to say that Chartres is Platonic? In Plato's philosophy, the physical world is a shadow of the real world of forms timeless, perfect archetypes of which everything we see is an imperfect copy. A circle drawn in sand is only a faint echo of the true, perfect circle. For the thinkers of Chartres, geometry was a way to approach these ideals. By building with perfect ratios 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 2, square root 2, they believed they were bringing a bit of divine order into the material world. This was not mere symbolism, it was ritual construction. The circle represented eternity, the divine, the infinite. The square represented creation, earth, and the four elements. The triangle stood for the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Chartres is filled with these shapes. Its rose windows are built of nested circles and squares. Its vaults rest on pointed arches derived from equilateral triangles. Its floorplan is a cruciform grid based on squared modules. Even its towers are symbolic. The North Tower, older and Romanesque, is more massive and grounded. The South Tower, later and Gothic, rises higher and lighter. Scholars have suggested they represent the Old and New Testaments, or even the two natures of Christ, human and divine. Geometry wasn't ornament, it was doctrine in stone. The crypt, a world below. Beneath the radiant cathedral lies the crypt, the oldest part of Chartres, dating back to the 9th century and earlier. It is a dark, winding space, built around a sacred well and an ancient chapel. Here the stone is plain, the light is scarce. You descend from the upper world of stained glass and golden proportion into a realm of shadow and earth. But this, too, was part of the design. The crypt and choir above mirror each other. Where the upper space soars toward the heavens, the crypt burrows into the deep, a symbolic descent into the womb of the earth, the underworld, the mystery of incarnation. At its heart lies the Well of the Strong, believed to be a former Druidic site, later Christianized. For centuries, it was said that this spot held a statue of a virgin giving birth, predating Christianity, an image absorbed into the cult of Notre Dame sous terre, Our Lady underground, an early form of Marian devotion. This subterranean virgin became part of Chartres identity. Pilgrims would descend to pray to her in darkness before rising into the cathedral's bright nave. It was a spiritual journey through space, from matter to light, from earth to heaven, from mystery to revelation. The builders understood this. They did not erase the past, they built upon it. The portal of the philosophers. Perhaps the most direct expression of the cathedral's intellectual heritage is the royal portal, the central entrance of the western facade. Sculpted in the mid-12th century, before the fire of 1194, it survived and was incorporated into the rebuilt cathedral. Its sculptures are unlike anything in Romanesque art. Instead of fierce demons or chaotic hellscapes, we find stoic kings and queens, seated calmly beneath canopies. Most notably, we find the archivolts of the liberal arts. In concentric arches above the doors, 8 female figures represent grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, with their symbolic tools compasses, scrolls, abacuses. These are the disciplines taught at Chartres School, carved in stone. Above them, small male figures represent famous classical authors: Euclid, Ptolemy, Cicero, Boethius, pagan philosophers in a Christian cathedral. This was radical, but it was also the heart of the Chartres worldview. Truth is one, and all truth, whether classical or Christian, points toward God. The builders did not fear Plato or Pythagoras. They used them. They saw the cathedral not as a rejection of the past, but its fulfillment. A temple of wisdom, illuminated by faith. Windows of the guilds. Another layer of meaning at Chartres lies in its donor windows, many of which were funded by local craft guilds. Unlike Cluny, a monastic world apart, Chartres was a cathedral embedded in its city. The windows show not only saints and biblical scenes, but shoemakers, carpenters, wheelwrights, and bakers, all participating in the sacred. This was more than flattery. It reflected a theological principle, that all human work, if done with honesty and order, was part of divine creation. The geometry of the builder, the rhythm of the blacksmith, the measure of the clothier, all were echoes of God's act of shaping the world. In this way, the cathedral itself became a civic theology, not just for monks, but for the entire community. Each trade had a place in the divine structure. The cathedral as ladder. In the medieval mind, salvation was a ladder. This image comes from Saint Benedict, whose rule describes a ladder of humility that ascends to heaven. Chartres is filled with ladders, visual, symbolic, and structural. The ascending levels of architecture: crypt, nave, right arrow, clerestory, right arrow, vault. The progression of light: darkness, right arrow, color, right arrow, brilliance. The movement of the pilgrim: earth, right arrow, prayer, right arrow, transcendence. The very act of entering the cathedral, walking its nave, gazing upward, and approaching the altar was a ritual climb. This is sacred architecture, not just as container, but as experience. One did not merely look at Chartres. One moved through it, and in doing so, participated in its message. Chartres is often called the summa of Gothic architecture, a synthesis of reason and faith, matter and spirit, light and stone. But it is also a philosopher's cathedral, built not just with tools, but with ideas. And so we ask, is it possible to walk through an idea? At Chartres, the answer seems to be yes. You do not just walk through space, you walk through a worldview, one shaped by ratio, number, myth, and mystery. You step out of the cathedral, blinking at the sunlight. The soaring vaults, the kaleidoscope of glass, the whisper of centuries all still echo behind you. But as the doors close, a new space opens up, the space of memory. Chartres is still standing. Unlike Cluny, it was not reduced to fragments. It was not sacked in full nor turned to rubble. Yet it too has suffered. Revolution, secularism, war, and the indifferent erosion of time have all taken their toll. But even in decline, it has endured. In this final section, we trace how Chartres moved from medieval sacred geometry to modern historical imagination. We look at the cathedral not just as a monument to the past, but as a living diagram, a sacred shape that continues to shape thought, long after its builders have vanished. We ask, what happens when geometry outlasts its age? When sacred meaning no longer seems obvious? Can proportion still carry purpose? We begin with ashes. The French Revolution and the Age of Unbuilding. In 1793, during the height of the French Revolution, cathedrals across France were defaced, repurposed, or destroyed. Christianity was condemned as a relic of monarchy and superstition. Priests were persecuted. Religious icons were smashed. Chartres was targeted too. Revolutionary crowds broke statues and defaced portals. The famous North Tower was nearly destroyed, but spared at the last moment supposedly by a local architect who convinced the mob of its artistic value. The labyrinth, so carefully preserved since the 13th century, was hidden under chairs and later removed in parts by church authorities who found it disruptive. Many stained glass windows were shattered, relics disappeared. The statue of the Black Madonna, a symbol of pre-Christian and Marian syncretism, was burned in public, its ashes cast to the wind. The revolutionaries had not just toppled thrones, they sought to erase memory. But they failed. Chartres endured damage but structurally intact, and in the centuries that followed, it entered a new phase of life, as a subject of restoration, scholarship, and inspiration. Viollet-le-Duc and the Gothic Revival. In the 19th century, a new movement emerged, Gothic Revival. Artists, architects, and philosophers, disillusioned with Enlightenment rationalism and industrial uniformity, turned back to the Middle Ages for beauty and meaning. Chief among them was Eugene Viollet-le-Duc, the famous French restorer who took on Notre Dame de Paris and other cathedrals. While he never fully reconstructed Chartres, his writings helped shape the idea of the Gothic as a rational, organic, and symbolic architecture. He argued that Gothic architecture was not chaotic as Enlightenment critics claimed, but deeply ordered, even scientific. Chartres, for him, was an example of functional harmony where form followed use, but also symbol. His vision influenced not only French architecture, but English, German, and American designers, who saw in the cathedral a symbol of spiritual transcendence through structure. And slowly, the pieces of Chartres were restored. The stained glass was repaired. The sculptures were studied and preserved. The labyrinth, long hidden, was uncovered again. The North Tower, once nearly felled by a mob, now became an icon. Chartres became a pilgrimage of scholars and architects, not just of believers. Chartres and the language of modern architecture. You might think that a 13th century cathedral would be irrelevant in the age of glass and steel, but Chartres continued to haunt modernity. Le Corbusier, though a modernist, studied Chartres extensively. He spoke of its pure form and spiritual logic. Mies van der Rohe, known for his minimalism, was fascinated by the verticality and proportion of Gothic cathedrals. Even Frank Lloyd Wright, champion of organic architecture, admired how Chartres was rooted in its environment, with towers that mirrored the hills and windows that filtered natural light. In the 20th century, spiritual architects like Louis Kahn and Tadao Ando looked to Chartres not for style, but for presence, that quiet, geometric gravity that makes a building feel more than built. In this way, Chartres continues to speak a language that modern architecture still understands, a language of space, light, and proportion. The pilgrimage today. Pilgrims still walk to Chartres. Each year, thousands make the Notre Dame de Chrétienté pilgrimage, walking over 100 kilometers from Paris to Chartres in 3 days. The reasons vary: religious devotion, cultural heritage, aesthetic awe, but the experience remains the same, to approach something beyond the self. The cathedral receives over 1 million visitors a year. Many come for the windows, or to walk the labyrinth, or to sit in silence in the choir. And many, perhaps without realizing, are participating in a kind of unconscious ritual, moving through space, from the shadowed nave toward the luminous apse, from below to above, from the crypt to the clerestory. They may not speak the language of sacred geometry, but they feel it. They are walking the diagram, the geometry of light. In recent years, advanced light studies and 3D scanning have revealed that Chartres was even more sophisticated than scholars had known. The angle of the sun at solstices aligns with specific windows. The placement of columns subtly shifts the acoustics of chant. The proportions of bays and arches correspond to musical intervals, suggesting that the space was tuned like an instrument. One study found that light on the Feast of the Assumption, August 15, enters through a specific lancet and lands briefly at the center of the nave, suggesting that the cathedral was calibrated to the liturgical calendar, a kind of cosmic sundial. This is not coincidence. It is craft. Chartres is a building of light as much as of stone. Remembering the lost code. And yet so much is lost. We no longer fully understand the meaning of every proportion, the intent of every window, the symbolism of every carving. Much was never written down. Much was never meant to be spoken aloud. The medieval world built its truths into the shape of things, not into text. The code was carved, colored, and measured, not printed. And so we are left to reconstruct the grammar of the sacred through fragments. The Virgin of the Pillar, now just a replica. The labyrinth, its center plaque missing. The statues, eroded by wind and weather. The windows, cleaned and restored, but removed from their original grime-softened glow. We preserve the shape, but do we still know how to read it? Final reflections. Chartres is not merely a building. It is a palimpsest, a manuscript written over time, where old meanings fade and new ones emerge. It began as a pagan site, then a Roman temple, then a Romanesque church, then a Gothic cathedral, then a revolutionary shell, then a romantic ideal, now a tourist site and UNESCO heritage monument. But the shape endures. Its geometry still teaches. Its light still falls. Its arches still rise like a ladder toward something not seen. And so we end with this. Can a shape be sacred even when we forget why? Can the proportion of a bay, the rhythm of a vault, the silence of a crypt still carry meaning when the world around it has changed? Chartres suggests yes, because the divine may not be in the meaning we give. It may be in the measure itself.